Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. This week's questions answered video, the ban or proposed ban on Bumpfire stocks. So the recent tragedy in Florida, the spree killing at Parkland High School, has renewed, or at least brought back to the boil, if you will, the debate on gun control, which is a never-ending battle. Everybody's familiar with that. Just recently, there was a support from the president for the potential banning of Bumpfire stocks. And this raises a somewhat common issue that we face in the gun community. And I'm using the term community right now very loosely because sometimes we don't behave like that. Sometimes we get on one side of the issue or the other and we don't really see eye to eye on certain things. There are people who are like, well, whatever, I don't use Bumpfire stocks. I don't use Bumpfire stocks either. I don't own one. I don't really see a purpose to them other than for strictly gun entertainment, which is fine. The larger issue is the fact that if we allow, or if we support, or if we ignore the ban on a device such as a Bumpfire stock, then we're opening ourselves up for a considerable amount of legislation because of the way that such things are to be banned. The president has directed Mr. Jeff Sessions to pursue and look at the potential banning of the stock through the ATF. I have a problem with that because the ATF enforces regulations. Regulations can be changed at will, and a regulation has the power of a law. However, it doesn't necessarily have to go through the same scrutiny to become a regulation as a law goes through to become a law. So if anything was to be considered about banning a Bumpfire stock, that should go to Congress. It shouldn't be done arbitrarily through a government agency that enforces regulations that it creates. It also enforces the definitions of those regulations that it creates. So to me, there's a bit of an issue there when an agency is allowed to create a regulation by its own definitions and then enforce the law based on the definitions that it created. There's not a lot of oversight involved in that other than the very straight up family tree under that particular branch of government. So we end up with legislation that is knee-jerk, legislation that is emotionally driven, and legislation that can be easily altered through further regulation or redefinition, because it's not like the ATF has ever changed its mind on something twice, 6, 7, 12, 14 times. And while it leads to very entertaining memes on the internet, it doesn't really help any of us in the gun community to be legally compliant. And the irony is the people who aren't legally compliant don't care anyway. We know that trope. We've heard it before. We'll hear it again. But it doesn't take away from the fact that if we are going to support a Bumpfire stock ban because we don't use Bumpfire stocks, and I'd say we, I mean me and a bunch of other people, don't be so quick to run out and fall on your sword for the sake of the firearms that you use. It's not like the Bumpfire stock is going to take one for the team and they're not going to come for additional encroaching regulations. Depending on how the ATF decides to define what a Bumpfire stock does, machine gun-like rate of fire, you could lose any number of accessories on your AR-15 or other firearm. The NRA is not going to do us any favors on this one. That's just my prediction, just based on the past couple days since the president has said that he'd be willing to support a ban on Bumpfire stocks. I haven't seen a lot out of the NRA in regards to that, except for some of the NRA commentators like Colian, Mr. Dewar there. I don't know what I can say about the NRA that I haven't already said in the past. I'm very critical of that organization because just like many lobbying organizations, if they don't have anything to lobby for, they don't serve a purpose. And I'm not saying that they're in the support of certain attacks on gun control, or I should say attacks on gun freedoms so they can continue to exist in those organizations, but sometimes they make very curious decisions that don't support the whole of the organization, which goes back to the whole point of this video. I'm not a Bumpfire stock guy, but I am a gun owner, and the guys that own Bumpfire stocks are gun owners too, which means we're all supposed to be on the same team. And while I don't really agree with their choice of accessories and firearms for their practice and their training and their hobbies, I do recognize the fact that they have every right to have that device for whatever purpose, lawful purpose, they're going to use it for. On the other side of the coin, like we AR-15 type mentality people sometimes don't get support from the hunting community. Guys that hunt with double barrel over-under shotguns and just shoot ducks and deer, they don't really understand the AR-15. And we're facing a kind of an issue the same way there, in that the community isn't as a whole. And that's why I said use the term community loosely, because different little niches or genres or subcategories, or however you want to define it, within the gun owning community don't necessarily agree with each other. And this isn't going as fact to saying, well, this kind of firearm, or I'm a Glock guy, or I'm a SIG guy. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with what you use your firearms for. If you own your firearms primarily for hunting and you don't carry for self-defense, then you're probably not going to be paying too much attention to the people who are self-defense minded, because you're like, well, I don't carry a gun anyway because I don't need it, or maybe you've got your own personal reasons for it, or maybe you live in a state where you can't, so you don't really focus and pay attention to the issues of people who face those problems. A perfect example is states like California. Those of us who don't live in California, we sometimes make fun of the people who do, saying, oh, you should just move, or, you know, I don't know how you live behind enemy lines, where it's not as easy to just pick up and move for most people, especially when your whole family's been built in a state that, well, has continually encroached on its citizens' gun rights. If you want to see what can happen in the rest of the United States, you only have to look at the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast. You see states like Oregon, which become progressively more anti-gun. Washington, same thing. California has always been the butt of the joke when it comes to gun laws. If it can happen in California, there's no reason why it can't happen in other states. It's just going to take more time. I've personally been told by an anti-gun person that we may not get you, but we will get your kids. So it's a generational thing. They're willing to play the long game in order to disarm us. Sometimes the conversation requires more of an intelligent response than, well, it's just my rights. On the internet, we're not going to change anybody's mind. But in person, we can have conversations with people and say, this is why the Second Amendment exists. We know it's not about hunting. It's not. It has nothing to do with hunting whatsoever. If it did, it might specifically mention that somewhere in the actual amendment, or the conversations and the letters and all the historical research that we have that involved the amendment's creation itself, or case law that stemmed from it. We got to have those one-on-one conversations, but we also have to do it intelligently, and we also have to do it with a degree of respect. You may not respect the other person's opinion, but by not respecting your opinion, do you think you're really convincing them to respect yours? No. And of course, you can use the argument, well, oh, it's just the law. Laws can change, amendments can change. And again, I don't see the Second Amendment being repealed anytime soon. But if we don't literally, and I hate to say it because it's a bit of cliche, but if we don't win hearts and minds on this, we're not doing ourselves any favors by becoming more and more standoffish, aggressive, detracted from those people who don't necessarily share our views. We have to be able to have an intelligent conversation on this topic, and Bumpfire Stocks, unfortunately, becomes the one thing that we end up penning on, not because of the device itself, but because of the potential implications that can come from a ban on Bumpfire Stocks. If the Bumpfire stock is added to considered a destructive device or something like that requires an NFA registration, that's a loss. Even if you don't have one, that's a loss. And that loss can lead to, you may find Geisley triggers added to the list. You may find any aftermarket trigger, non-manufactured OEM trigger added to the list. They may even go so far as to specify you can't have one single stage triggers anymore, or you can't have a trigger less than X pounds. It sounds ridiculous, but if you allow for the ATF to define machine gun-like function, we can literally see very, very nonsensical, retarded, proper use of the word, laws passed that restrict our right to shoot fast. Yeah, I don't use a Bumpfire stock, but I do like to be able to shoot as fast as I can accurately shoot because the situation may call for it. So instead of rolling your eyes, and believe me, I'm guilty of the same thing. Sometimes I want to roll my eyes when we start talking about Bumpfire stocks and things like that. We have to look at the larger implications and the bigger picture of if there is a ban. So specifically to the question on Bumpfire stocks, no, I don't use them. I don't care for them. I don't really see a point to them other than, like I said, gun entertainment. However, when it comes to banning that device, the implications are far too large for me to kind of just, you know, shrug and ignore it, because it's not something I do. And on the other side of the coin, it shouldn't be the same mentality of someone who doesn't use an AR-15 or firearms for self-defense. They're more hunting mindset. They own guns because their family's always hunted or whatever heritage reasons they have. They shouldn't shrug off our side either. So whatever side of the coin you're on or whatever side of the conversation you're on, we need to be a little bit more community oriented, and that starts with winning those conversations one-on-one, talking to those people. Hopefully not on the internet, because it's very hard to change someone's mind on the internet, even though we all try. But at the end of the day, respectful and willing to have the conversation. There are a lot of very purposely disingenuous people out there on the other side of the gun debate. You don't have to talk to those people, but there are people who are open-minded enough that we can help them see why we see things the way we do and why the Second Amendment is so important to us as Americans. I hope that answers the question. If you have any other questions on this topic or any other topic, feel free to drop them in the comment section below. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.